Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Rawson with Art Builds Community, and I will be moderating today's Artist Honoring Women. First, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We would like to begin this program by recognizing that while we gather in Santa Clara County, we are gathered on the ethno-historic tribal territory of the Tamian Ohlone, which included the lands of the Paleños, and who were related to the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, who were missionized into Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and San Francisco. The lands on which Santa Clara County are established was and continued to be of great significance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone constructed and maintained the 3 Bay Area missions. The city of San Jose and Santa Clara County extends to surrounding areas that held several tupentak, traditional roundhouses, which were once located at the historic Lupiniegos land grant, Rancho Pozolmi y Positas de las Animas, and also at Marcelo, Pio, and Cristobal's land grant, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as the nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. The Greater Santa Clara County communities also desire to honor the military service of the Muwekma men and women who have honorably served overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United States Armed Forces today. Thank you. Artist Honoring Women is a program under Womanhood, a Santa Clara County art-centered project that will recognize the historic contributions of Santa Clara County women across all intersectional identities to the region and beyond. To find out more about the Womanhood Project, please visit the project's website, www.womanhoodproject.org, and sign up for emails to keep informed. What is Womanhood? Womanhood is a Santa Clara County-wide art-centered project that will recognize the historic contributions of Santa Clara County women across all intersectional identities to the region and beyond. In 2018, the County of Santa Clara's supervisors began a conversation about how women are represented in public spaces and endorsed a plan for artworks that commemorate their achievements. In 2020, the Office of Women's Policy launched Womanhood, a project that will honor the historic contributions of women across all intersectional identities and acknowledging that this region was originally occupied by the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people. Womanhood is a public art and digital media project that will commission interactive, educational, and accessible artifacts and public artworks to promote the historical region and representation of women. The goal of the project, which was launched and supported by the County of Santa Clara, is to ensure equity and inclusion of women from all economic, employment, and cultural backgrounds by artfully highlighting their critical roles in the region and beyond. I'd like to introduce Rene Yung, the artist who we are speaking with today. Rene Yung is an artist, writer, cultural activist, and designer whose transdisciplinary works connect people, place, and history to articulate the hidden and give form to the overlooked. She founded the nonprofit organization Chinese Whispers to give voice to the forgotten history and experiences of the Chinese in the American West. She has collaborated with and consulted for numerous institutions, including the Museum of Chinese in the Americas and the Wing Luke Museum, and notably collaborated with the Stanford Archaeology Center on City Beneath the City, a series of art installations featuring artifacts excavated from the former site of the arson-destroyed Market Street Chinatown in San Jose. Yung has exhibited at international and national venues, including the Trans Culture, part of the 46th Venus Biennale, the Contemporary Art Museum Houston, San Jose Museum of Art, and Hausfeld Gallery in San Francisco. Yung has completed public art commissions with San Francisco Arts Commission and Seattle Arts Commission, as well as residencies at Montalvo Center for the Arts, Headland Center for the Arts, and Hedgebrook Writers Residency. A graduate of Stanford University, Yung is a native of Hong Kong, now living in San Francisco. I'm going to also give the bio of Chinese Whispers. So Chinese Whispers is a San Francisco-based nonprofit dedicated to uncovering the overlooked contributions and experiences of the early Chinese immigrants in the making of the American West. Founded in 2006 by artist Rene Yung, Chinese Whispers uses a systems-based program of research, storytelling, artistic productions, and public programs to give voice and visibility to the undervalued history of the Chinese immigrant experience. Chinese Whispers has launched numerous projects, including the multimedia storytelling theater works Sierra Stories and Golden Gate, that bring to life the experience of Chinese pioneers in the Sierra Nevada foothills and of Chinese immigrants in the Bay Area, respectively Bay Chronicles, retracing the forgotten history of Chinese shrimp fishing around the San Francisco Bay through a research expedition and a multimedia art installation. Programs including place-based storytelling events about the Chinese immigrant experience and cross-cultural, cross-generational community storytelling workshops. Yung continues a multi-platform investigation of the story of the Chinese shrimp fishery in Written on Water, linking place and memory with natural and built environments through a library of sculptural books, creative nonfiction, and mixed media artworks. Welcome, Rene. We're very excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everyone, for spending some of your Saturday lunchtime with us. I really am looking forward to this. So, and thank you for the great introduction, Amanda.
Of course.
Listening to the land acknowledgement, I couldn't help thinking how much that also relates to this history of this work of Chinese Whispers, which is very much about belonging and unbelonging. And I'm going to jump into this presentation about Chinese Whispers.
Great.
So I am a transdisciplinary artist in the sense that I work through different disciplines in order to find ways to learn about, engage, and express aspects of any topic that are relevant to the work. So Chinese Whispers has a backstory. I was commissioned by the Sun Valley Art Center in Sun Valley, in Ketchum, Idaho, to create a work about the Chinese miners and primarily miners and various laborers who worked in the Wood River Valley around Sun Valley. Now, I knew nothing about the history. I'm an immigrant from Hong Kong, a city girl who spent board years in Silicon Valley, as a matter of fact, until, I moved around and eventually settled in San Francisco. But this commission was a really important education for me about Chinese American history. And it was something that I actually didn't personally relate to because it seemed so long ago. I didn't know anything about it. But the issues of disbelonging, of unbelonging, of displacement, all of that, just really struck me as well as other aspects. So this installation, I created over 400 bars of soap and created a wall, and visitors could take a piece of soap and wash these towels that were imprinted with words of identity. And as the soap was used, the word remember was washed off. And the act of engagement somehow brought people out to share their memories about the Chinese in the area. And I was astonished by some of the stories. And then I asked this one person who was telling me about, I think, some Chinese in the backwoods there. I said, what happened to them? And I don't know, they went away. So the next thing I did, I was invited by the Art Center to do a public workshop. And we created these 3 bed sheets with the words, they went away. And in the mountain sunshine and dew and thunderstorms, the words they went away remained, but the images, which were painted with a mixture of soy sauce, seaweed, green tea, and turmeric, they washed away, they went away. And so that led me to think about this whole history. Now, in today's anti-Asian resurgence, this particular poster from 1892 is sadly very resonant. 1892 was 10 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into legislation by President Chester A. Arthur. Actually, the anniversary date of this ignoble Act was just a couple of days ago, May 6th, 139 years ago. It was not repealed until 1943 as a gesture towards Chinese because America wanted them as an ally during World War II. And so this also led me to ponder issues of public memory, of presence and absence. How does absence in public memory happen? What is the social amnesia? We know that history is being rewritten constantly. Public amnesia is a form of social and cultural erasure, whether by covering up or by expunging or by refabricating. Our previous president certainly was a prime example of that. And so the questions that I wanted to ask with my work was, whose story gets told? Whose story gets remembered? And who gets to tell the story? And so Chinese Whispers was born. It didn't start in a clean, formulated way. It started with this intention. So the project is part forensics to unearth the erased and covered up and forgotten, part restorative, not in order to recreate what has been lost, but to acknowledge the loss and absence. And in the fact of bringing light to the loss and absence, retrace the fragmentary threads without trying to make a complete story. So the main tenets of this whole effort is to reclaim overlooked history, retell forgotten stories, rekindle collective memory, and reconnect heritage with place. And that goes back to that whole aspect of belonging. So I began in the Sierra Nevada with a project called Sierra Stories. It was in Placer County, and I got a little California documentary project grant in collaboration with the Placer Arts Council. I guess they're now called the Arts Council of Placer County. So my research was in the Sierra Nevada foothills up to about maybe 2,000, 2,500 feet from outside Sacramento up through the foothills. Now, with the neophyte enthusiasm, the rose-colored, rose-tinted glasses, I traveled all over the foothills looking for people who could tell me stories about the early pioneers in the area, the early Chinese pioneers there, along the spine of the transcontinental railroad, which is the main piece of history where any mention of Chinese was sparsely and intermittently mentioned. Well, academics I consulted told me, good luck. There's hardly any remaining primary records. And so I trudged along, or drove along and trudged along. The images on the bottom, for example, there's the famous picture, you've probably seen it, of the long trestle with Chinese laborers building this astonishing engineering feat. And I talked to a lot of people and was pointed. Nobody actually particularly knew. They said, it's probably here. And so this is, on the right is a section of the highway near the hamlet of Gold Run. Of course, in the area, there would be a hamlet called Gold Run near the American River. And so the map on the right is this beautiful map made on silk. And it's that kind of richness of details as well as of mystery in this. And the project culminated in a storytelling theater work that featured 11 community members from the area. They were not actors. A couple of them, did do acting as a side interest, and they relate these stories. Now, I started out with 2 leads, and 3 years later, I had made 80 interviews. Most of the interviewees were not Chinese. The Chinese in the area eventually fled the relentless anti-Chinese violence in the late 19th century and early 20th century toward more urban enclaves with more Chinese, larger Chinatowns like San Francisco and Sacramento. And also, descendants didn't want to go back to that hard scrabble, laborious lives of the early settlers in the mountains. So in this staged reading, the stories were primarily from the perspective of non-Chinese Euro-Americans and their memories, handed down memories of the Chinese among them. And then there were some Chinese families whom I was able to contact. Now, in the context of womanhood, these stories are primarily about men. Most of the immigrants were men. It was a patriarchal society, still is. And so women, first of all, were not really of note. And the few women who did come to America in those early days, the census and public records all labeled them as prostitutes, you know, even from age 14 to older. And at the same time, people did have memories of, actually, there's one story they told. They said, well, there was this one woman, they had repatriated all the bones from the graveyards in the areas back to China for burial. But there's this one woman whose big toe, a bone from her big toe was somehow left in the, I mean, this is completely apocryphal, right? Her big toe was left in the grave. They had forgotten to take it. I don't know how they figured that out. I was actually led to a graveyard completely unmarked with mounds where it was probably the Chinese graveyard there. So I came back to San Francisco full of enthusiasm about continuing this excavation in the area where I live. And I also began to be very interested in the completely overlooked maritime history of the Chinese in the Bay Area. It turned out they actually had a significant, the Chinese had a significant maritime contribution in the fisheries, both along the coast and in the Bay. So I formed a partnership very early on with the San Francisco Maritime National Historical Park, which is part of the National Park Service. And Chinese Whispers started out with a workshop reading from some of the interviews I had made in San Francisco Bay Area. This was on the ferry boat Eureka. Oh, here goes the fire truck. And at High Street Pier. It turned out to have been Super Bowl Sunday. We didn't plan it quite right, but we were completely, there was an overflow crowd. People wanted to learn about these things, and they were excited by this storytelling on board this 19th century ferry boat. And the project, the event included audience story circles, and people were very actively engaged in telling and sharing and querying, and it was very intergenerational, intercultural. So then began this tradition of Chinese New Year activities, generally around the Lunar New Year, in collaboration again with the Maritime Historical Park. And this time we moved on to the Balclutha, a 19th century square-rigged sailing ship that included, it was a cargo ship eventually, and it included Chinese workers and section on the boat. So these, this particular event, in the lower two slides, you see people playing the Chinese Whispers game. Chinese Whispers, the name, refers to a name given to the game that sometimes is called telephone, you know, where you pass something on from one person to the next until it becomes unintelligible, as a metaphor for how this kind of garbled and misconstrued public memory is handed down to us. It's also an elegiac, poetic reference to the whisper, to the fragmentary nature of this. But anyhow, people were playing Chinese whispers game. For grown-ups to do this, there's a lot of giggling and releasing of inhibition. It was fun, it was informative, but we also had important information passed on by park staff who presented, as well as poetry. In the bottom right is poet Jenny Lim, who read some fantastic poems. And again, from another event to show the audience interaction, the community really, really responded to hearing their own stories. They relate, if not directly, then at least like, oh yeah, that happened to my grandpa or grandma. Or maybe that is what I didn't get to hear because they never told me. And an important part of what Chinese Whispers included in the San Francisco Bay Area, I wanted to factor in a new generation of immigrant. You know, there have been multiple generations of immigration from the early days, 150 or more years ago. And so in collaboration with the Chinatown YMCA, which is this fantastic, vibrant community organization that has an excellent immigrant engagement program, we did storytelling workshops. And with long-term immigrants, people who've been here, 20 or more years, new immigrants who recently arrived, youth, it was intergenerational. And especially for the new immigrants, it was incredibly cathartic for them to find out that somebody actually wants to hear what their experience is. They are completely stressed out trying to survive in a country where most of them don't know the language well. They're of a socioeconomic class where, day-to-day living is a struggle. And it's not untrue to say that they're here for the proverbial American dream, whatever that dream may be today. And it was an experience with, again, laughter, with tears. And in this instance, with the contemporary immigrants, way more women participated and shared stories than men. So in 2014, we were ready. We went on stage with a full-length multimedia theater, storytelling theater work at Southside Theater in Fort Mason. This is a scene about two new immigrants talking about how cold it was when they first arrived, stories of nourishment, a scene from a scene about the Chinese Exclusion Act and people, and in this, the woman raising her hand was saying, yes, we were discriminated against, and eventually everybody raised their hands. But then that was transformed into this tree of growth. Well, meanwhile, we also set sail. Part of the lure of this partnership with the Maritime National Historical Park is that they have a replica, beautiful replica 19th century Chinese shrimping vessel. And we were able to get a generous grant from the Creative Work Fund to do a research expedition on San Francisco Bay to retrace some of the Chinese shrimp fishing sites in the bay. There were probably 50, according to the records, 50 or more camps that ring the bay. And today, only China Camp remains as the vestiges of a former camp. So this project is very, very research-based. I fell into the rabbit hole of looking at fish and game records, looking at historical maps. The map on the left is an 1889 map that shows different kinds of fishing grounds and fishing sites along the bay, including Chinese camps. And that was a very, very important document for identifying our route, which on the right, you see, we weren't even able to go to very many of them. We went as far south as Redwood City, and then as far north as China Camp in Marin. And again, these are these details. I think this is a really wonderful contrast between then and now. And sometimes, you know, I look at this picture and remember the struggles, and I think, you know, there are these like 15th century or medieval images of the ship of fools. And sometimes I feel like, is that, maybe that's what we were, but we were on this quest. And we were armed with contemporary technology, incredible sound, audio equipment, video, photo. The boat was armed to the teeth with GoPros. And on the left is one of the morning musters before we set sail, except we were mustering on our knees. And in this project, I also reached out to many different partners in different communities, especially in the science community. San Francisco Estuary Institute is this incredible organization that also has a historical ecology department. And scientists from SFEI brought these awesome historical maps that we could reference, again, to guide our sails. And on the right, you see the project management spreadsheet, a constantly evolving monster that went on for pages and pages. And here you see, again, the then and now. The upper two images are of San Bruno. On the right was a fairly vibrant shrimping camp at San Bruno. It doesn't look like much. It looks pretty dilapidated. And if you look at contemporary accounts of those shrimp camps that were all derogatory about how they smelled and how shabby they were, but they were living, people were living there and working. On the left is the probably the contemporary site of where that camp was, and it actually is the Genentech campus. On the bottom two slides are the images. On the left is a drying yard in Hunters Point, which had the last remaining and most number of shrimp camps in San Francisco. And on the right, we sailed into India Basin near, again, the probable former site of one of the last shrimp camps. And in the back, you see the remains of the PG&E power plant. So, you know, history is incredibly complicated. And so now, oh, and on the right, bottom right, is an image of the late Frank Kwan, the grandfather of Chinese shrimp fishing research and history. And he was just amazing to have on board. So now let's look at a short video about the Bay Chronicle sale.
The San Francisco Bay was once home to a thriving Chinese shrimp fishery. In the late 19th century, more than 26 Chinese shrimp camps ringed the bay. But by the mid-20th century, discriminatory laws effectively shut down the Chinese shrimp fishing industry. Artist Rene Yung, herself an immigrant, developed the project Chinese Whispers Bay Chronicles to retrace this forgotten history of a forgotten immigrant community. A team of artists, historical ecologists, and cultural experts set sail on the National Park Service's replica 19th century junk, the Grace Kwan, to former Chinese shrimping sites around San Francisco Bay. It was an 8-hour voyage sailing across San Francisco Bay from Richmond down to San Mateo in the South Bay. We could almost imagine what it was like when the Chinese fishermen navigated these sloughs in the 19th century. In retracing this forgotten history, we can reimagine and, most importantly, retell the story of Chinese shrimp fishing in San Francisco Bay and honor the memory of an immigrant community which had enriched the vibrancy of the San Francisco Bay region.
So that was pretty amazing. And the expedition, which took place over 2 weeks, we had 6 sails, and we had public engagement programs at major landing sites. This was a kickoff event at the Craneway Pavilion in Richmond, and demonstration to the public about aspects of the Great Swan. People go on board and kind of tour. This was an event in Hunters Point at the Eco Center. Again, an enormous system of partners. And Bayview was, as I said earlier, one of the largest Chinese fishing communities. And community members from what is now, well, actually, of course, it's being gentrified and the demographics is changing again. But since World War II, when the Naval Yard was built there and workers were imported from the South, essentially, to work in the war effort, then the demographics of Bayview Hunters Point changed to primarily African American. And in recent years, there had been conflicts between the Asian community and the African community. And yet at this event, community members told stories about how Blacks and Chinese coexisted side by side. This one gentleman talked about how his babysitter was Chinese. He's a Black man, and that he spoke Chinese as a kid. So people became interested again in their local community engagement, and we had a slew of speakers, and it was very interesting. And I think it stirred some interest in the Bayview Hunters Point community to reconnect with this intercultural history. Then we had a grand finale celebration at Chinatown, which of course had to include a lion dance, and it was a really exhausting 2 weeks. I got my sea legs by the end of that. I really, in a way, wanted to continue to get back on that ship and keep sailing on the bay. There's so much to discover. We have hours of video and audio captured on the sail. And this is an immersive multimedia installation that used that material. It took place in the theater of the Maritime National Historical Park in the museum. So visitors actually have to go through all this maritime memories and artifacts to get to the theater. This enormous sail comes out of the very institutional blue velvet curtains. Again, the intrusion of memory and narrative into institutional space. What can be more institutional than the Department of Interior, right, which runs the national parks? And video is projected onto the sail, and it's a translucent sail. haptic speakers, transducers, convert the sound waves from the captured on the sails into palpable pulsations on that bench. So when you sit there, you feel the waves slapping against the bench. And the choice of exhibiting at the Maritime National Historical Park totally makes sense. It's another form of public engagement where we take this very important piece of forgotten history, expressed in and engaging and I think, you know, visually engaging and intellectually engaging form in a place that the public goes to beyond art museums and art galleries. For example, the the Maritime Park has an annual visitorship of almost 5 million pre-pandemic, you know, dropped to 4 million something. You know, it's way more than, say, the SF would get. And it's a very different kind of audience. So this is also part of the Chinese Whispers strategy. Although I have to say, I had a hell of a time trying to get curators to come and look at it. It's like, what? It's in a park, in a visitor center, right? But, you know, it takes the proverbial village to make these things happen. So this is just some of the partners, sponsors, and funders, but especially countless individuals who came together over the years to bring the Chinese Whispers vision to life, to give voice back to the community where it has been buried, taken away for generations, and, you know, in many cases for more than a century. Now, some of you who were there on this path are here today, and I actually feel emotional saying this. I can't see you, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart. So after these humongous endeavors over a dozen years, something pulled me toward redialing the lens toward the small. Yet the small captures the scope of time, place, and memory. And as part of my fellowship, urban fellowship at the Fisher Bay Observatory in the Exploratorium, I created the first 2 books in a library of sculptural books that I'm calling Written on Water. And each book is inspired by a former shrimping site. This one is a book called Lacrimal. Lacrimal means relating to tears or weeping, and it's about the history of the Baby Hunters Point Chinese camps, which were burned down by the health department because the Navy wanted the land for a shipyard on the West Coast as America stood poised for World War II. And this is a picture before and after the camp, either hours or days before it was torched by the health department in 1939. At the back of the book is the sculptural part. There are these plaster blocks, and clasped between them is a vial that contains 2 millimeters of salt water at the approximate salinity of human tears. The salt was extracted from bay water collected near the former Hunters Point fish camp. This is another book, Mordant, about China Camp. Mordant means, has a double meaning. It means something that's biting and something that fixes dyes in the material. So I'm using it as a metaphor for fugitive memory and how to fix it on a page. These are all botanical prints made from vegetation around the San Francisco Bay shoreline, like the ones that the Chinese fish camp, the Chinese shrimp fishers would have moved among. This particular print is of pickleweed and rushes. And at the back of the book is this quote from Frank Kwan, who devoted his life to keeping alive the knowledge and lore of Chinese shrimping and really a knowledge of San Francisco Bay. And this is an homage, a tribute to Frank, who passed away some years ago. And the project is a tribute to the unknown individuals, men and women, whose lives, as we said in the video, really enriched the Bay. And by the way, this photo on the right is one of the very few of a woman in the fish camps. And if you look at her dress, I think she may have dressed up for the photo. Note the jade bangles on her wrists. She clearly looks happy, like she belongs there. And so in summary, Chinese Whispers uses a dynamic system that integrates interdisciplinary research. It's founded on research, really, and equally in authentic engagement in the community. Without the community, we don't have the stories, and it's a feedback loop. Community gives us their stories, their memories, and we give back to them, enriched with research and created in multi-platform expressions that best convey this material. And above all, the whole thing has to come from a place of bold vision, that this can be done, it needs to be done, and we will do it. It is about public memory, and it is about place. So this is the end of the slides. Here's our contact information. And I think we're doing a Q&A, right?
Yes. Wow. That was amazing, Rene. I'm just in awe. I had a chance to look at your website before today and watch parts of the video, and I kind of wanted to also not watch the whole thing because I wanted to watch it, kind of most of it first here and have my response to it along with everybody else who maybe haven't seen it. And it just left me breathless. So thank you. What a powerful, powerful project. And you're still working on this project, is that correct?
I'm working on the smaller aspects of it. I am writing, again, under the umbrella of the title Written on Water, and it becomes more autobiographical. I grew up in Hong Kong, which is, of course, an island. And even though I couldn't swim to save my life, water is in my DNA. It is part of, I think the Chinese word for water, "soi," in Cantonese, was one of the first words I uttered as a child. So it's really exploring this history, writing about it. I wrote an essay for the Exploratorium, and I want to continue making the artist books. And with the pandemic especially, it's hard to do these public engagement projects.
Oh yes, we definitely know that with our Builds community, with our projects. I have, we're getting comments in the comment section. Thank you, everybody, for your hellos. I don't know if you can see that, Rene, but Marco V says hello, Park Project, John Seto, Richard May, Diana Bloom. So you definitely have a following here. I think it's fantastic. Welcome, everybody. Please continue to drop your questions and comments in the chat boxes from wherever you're watching, that be YouTube or Facebook. But I do have some questions here. One of them is, were you alone when you started this project? Did you kind of have a team when you started talking about the beginnings of this? I know that you had a team, obviously, when you were sailing and the community engagements, but maybe if you can kind of take us on what that that look like for you, and who were those components who played a part in the process?
I had a very tiny team when I started. I had an intern. I had 2 interns actually, who they were amazing. You know, they helped with all sorts of things, right? And we had videographer, photographer. I collaborated with the Pastor Arts Council, and Angela Tati, the then director, was fantastic and pulled together local people to help. And then I want to acknowledge Penny Avalon, who I believe is in the audience today. She is a dear old friend, well, I guess in my age I can say old, right? But, you know, in terms of just the years we spent together. And she was my partner in crime. Penny actually lives in Sierra, and I would email her and say, hey, I'm going up to the Sierra, want to join me? And we would go and visit all these places, and, you know, have an adventure.
Yeah, you know, I want to take a moment and just pause for a second, because I can feel your emotion and I can see it, and I'm somebody who reacts to others very. I have this empathy about me, I guess. And you know, your stories and your presentation really got me thinking about my own personal, whether I'm Mexican American, and I'm sure that has happened with so many others, right? And I think what you have done with these projects in the years, and building these partnerships and these connections and seeing these connections, you have been able to create these, being able to bring people to talk about the histories of their culture, but also create their own, right? Here you are telling the history of this project. And I just want to say thank you so much for opening up and sharing this very personal project. You know, I can feel it, and I just wanted to take that moment to say thank you. So,
thank you for the acknowledgement. Yeah,
of course.
I mean, I don't know any other way of being in the world than coming from the personal. And I think that part of the reason that people were willing to engage, when you're doing engagement, people sense where you're coming from. And in order to be able to have that authentic exchange, you need to build that trust. You know, and if people understand where you're coming from and why,
right,
then they can bring themselves to it, and it becomes a two-way street where the alchemy, is what I like to call it, is what sparks the material, what gives it life.
Yeah. You know, you worked with building partnerships. You know, we definitely heard that in your presentation, with the community, with the institutions, and you know, with our project Womanhood, you referenced it, so thank you. You know, our goal is to do the same. So, what would you say was your biggest obstacle in launching Chinese Whispers, and how did you overcome it?
Unfortunately, like most nonprofits, the biggest challenge is resources and funding.
Of course,
you know. Obviously, this is not a small project. Even when we did our Lunar New Year events, for example, you know, I created a script from whatever oral history interview materials were present at the time for the occasion. You know, we had to have rehearsals, we had to have tech, et cetera, so that it comes across with a kind of quality that gets past the surface chatter. So people, you know, this is what art is, right? This is how art operates. And so to put that all together requires huge resources. And the whole process of pulling it together is a continual challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something we see. And I would say, especially right now during the pandemic, I think one of the challenges is bringing people together, right? And so, I mean, who know what your project would have looked like during during COVID, right? I mean, I think a lot of people who are trying to do community engagement and being inclusive and accessible, we have to be creative, just like we would even without the pandemic, right?
Yeah, and I actually want to plug a project that I'm working on,
Mhm.
have been working on because of the pandemic, and it's called Ask the Pandemic. It's on Instagram, hashtag Ask the Pandemic.
Okay.
If you tag Rene Yung Studio, and it takes place primarily on Instagram, asking people to submit questions, comments related to being in the pandemic, and the theme and the shape sort of shifts as our experience of the pandemic changes, and then it also results in physical installations.
Mhm.
Two of them have been at Headland Center for the Arts, where I just finished a residency, and one is opening. Actually, it opened yesterday at the Luke Museum in Seattle as part of their exhibition called Community Spread, about how the APA community experienced the early days of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So, these are, I felt like, okay, I can't fret about how I can't do things the way I used to.
Right.
The conditions
Right.
just are not there. And how do I engage community? So that is, in answer to your question a couple of questions ago, this is part of how I'm thinking about creating engagement as well. What are new forms? Not just during pandemic, but moving forward. How
Right.
does that shape new ways of thinking?
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. Definitely. We have to keep going, right? I want to address maybe one of the questions here in the comment box. So Park Project says, so lovely. I'm curious about what were the most surprising stories you learned. What is the residence about then and now?
There's so many. I told the story about the woman's big toe. And the Sierra, maybe because I was new to it, but also because it's an area that's so vast where the power of place is incredible. You're there, your first story is about the Sierra. The human beings are little midgets on that landscape. So one of the stories I was told by a Caucasian gentleman whose I think great grandmother owned land that the Chinese had lived on, had a little village on, and so he remembered going with his grandma to collect rent.
Wow.
And also then said, well, I don't know if he saw it or he was told about it. There are these graveyards, Chinese cemeteries, where, because the men wore queues at the end of the Qing dynasty, many of the immigrants still wore queues. In the graveyard, they would have these queues hanging up in the trees to dry. They would bury the bodies. So, these are the intricacies of cultural memory. It doesn't change anything about world affairs, but I think I think this is where art can speak most compellingly. How do you take these tiny personal things? How do you translate it into palpable universalities? Now, that story, I have to confess, didn't make it into the script because there are just too many stories like that. And so, I'm sure many of them will come up, but that's just an example of something, an early memory.
There was a question earlier and asked if there were any, did you encounter any Chinese or descendants during the Idaho project?
There were exactly 2 Chinese in Ketchum, me and someone who moved there from San Francisco. I didn't encounter anybody there.
Okay.
And I think that's why that handed down storytelling thing really struck me. Like, oh my God, there are all these people who live there, and they went away.
Yeah.
How can you let that happen? How can I let that happen? No.
What was the response like from the community there, both from people who maybe moved there recently and people who have been there for generations. Did you have any negative response? Did you have any response of, I always wondered, what was that?
You mean in Idaho?
In Idaho, yeah.
No, because, it was sort of sheltered in the context of the art center. So people who came were curious and they were polite. You can read between the lines and try to figure out how they felt about the Chinese. There was definitely a sense of alien, they were strange. One of the first stories I heard was about a Chinese acupuncturist in the backwoods in Idaho who became famous as a healer. And so the pioneers Americans would go to him to have their Hmong set to get herbs. It was kind of amazing. But who was he? Where did he go? We don't know.
Yeah, interesting. And that's very different from I wrote down a lot of notes, so I'm looking for them, but from the experience that the millions of visitors had here in San Francisco at the Maritime, the park, those people, that what you just described said to happen at an art institution, right? And so then you go and you have this art installation of storytelling, bringing it into a public place that these people maybe weren't expecting to see it. I mean, that's it sounds like two different worlds, and the way people experienced it was very different because maybe they weren't seeking, or what was, am I understanding that correctly? The differences between the Idaho audience and the audience with the sale and installation in San Francisco?
Well, there's certainly numerous differences. One is time. This happened, I think that exhibition was 2006. And the sale was in 2014. And in those 8 years, I can't say that Americans have become more enlightened about race, but different conversations have emerged. And also, of course, geography. The Intermountain states are, they are their own kind of interior terrain. And the project didn't start out asking people to tell stories. It was more like a private memory. But people, it's almost like once people have those memories, they want to tell you. I'd be like hanging around there, maybe taking photos, and they say, oh yeah, did you know, blah, blah, or I remember, blah, blah. They shared it. It's as if the act of erasure that they were doing by washing away those words and washing away the word remember on the bar of soap triggered a kind of guilt, maybe, a need to almost confess, like, hey, did you know?
So powerful. Yeah. I mean, there was so much in your presentation. That's right. We started with the word remember, and that right there was already powerful, and we just kept going. I really loved your presentation. I mean, you went to whose story gets told, who gets to tell the story, absence in public memory, public amnesia. I mean, I would go as far as to say that's something that we have, that has been in the history books and goes all the way to now, right? We're seeing that with all the different cultures, and we're, with womanhood, that's something that we're trying to confront. We want people to remember those who have contributed to our Santa Clara County. Those who maybe like the woman who was in your last slide. We don't, I don't know if we know her name, what did she do? But is there a way to find out? Is there a way that are women like her here in our county that maybe she wasn't the heavy hitter, she wasn't the big, big name, but maybe she had made a difference in the community in some way?
I'm sure there were, and I didn't talk about another project that did happen, take place in Santa Clara County. You mentioned it in the bio, which is the City Beneath the City, in collaboration with the Stanford Archaeology Center. It's exactly about San Jose's first Chinatown that got burned by arson, and that is closer in history, and and because it's closer to urban centers, there are more records. that project worked with architectural fragments, but there's a lot more awareness and effort now for descendants and community and academics to look into this history. And the Stanford Chinese Railroad Workers Project did this massive research, multi-country, academic institution research about that history, and unearthed a lot more stuff. The kind of stuff that only someplace like Stanford can do. It's like this huge blast. I don't know what happens to that information. And that is where I see my mission as a transdisciplinary artist, is how do you bring that stuff out of academia, out of the archives, out of a few videos, in a form that people will get it, they get excited about, and they will feel it, and they will think about it. So
yes,
that's
exactly.
really what I'm looking for.
Exactly. I mean, when you think about the different places in a city, and there's buildings named after individuals. There's streets named after individuals. We don't always know those stories, and there isn't a plaque there that says why or what happened. And if there is, maybe it's very limited. So how do we? You're right. How do we pull out of that academia and learn about those kind of stories? And I feel like the story you just mentioned, the Ask the Pandemic, that's another form of getting outside of academia and being current with the way people are being relevant with the way people are engaging with one another, right? They're using social media to learn more of what's going on, which is really interesting as well. And actually goes to another question we had here. So you mentioned your project has been intergenerational. So have you seen a lot of younger generations participating and sharing their family stories or wanting to learn more about their history, or maybe even just the history that is in the community that they're living in, right? Because you mentioned the Black man who said he had a Chinese, was it a nanny or yeah, and so kind of there was like this recollection of the way his youth was. Did you hear any more of those?
To answer the first question about intergenerational, demographics is kind of interesting. We collected the boring data, which is useful. And in people in their 30s seems like in our project community, I don't know what it's like elsewhere. People in their 30s begin to be interested in this history. I think when you're younger, you're still struggling to find your independence, to find your identity. And, there are all those developmental steps that one goes through. But by 30s, people start feeling like, oh my God, I don't know anything about my family history. And quite a few people have instituted their own family inquiries to ask their parents, and also there's this cultural thing that certainly among the early immigrants, life was so hard. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to tell the kids, A, it was painful, and B, they felt shameful about it. They wanted to come and be successful and doing well and all that. So there was also inside the community, there was a suppression of memory and transmission as well. And I think that people are realizing now how valuable it is, how restorative it is, to have agency, to have voice, and to remember, not in order to live in the past, but to be more grounded in the present.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Wow. I apologize. There's really loud noise. I don't know if you can hear that happening near my home. I when you mentioned the history really makes us, it's talking about it as restorative and grounds us. And would you say that's kind of what was happening with the Chinese whispering, the telephone game? Were you seeing that kind of happen? People were feeling like that there was this sense of belonging that occurred.
Well, the game, it was more like you get to be silly. I've done it at family reunions,
Yeah.
where stern cousins, would start giggling and
Oh,
cracking up
yes.
at what their kids said.
Yeah.
So I think that that's part of engagement, is that it's
Yeah.
not all serious, it's not all tears. You need to act out. And I'm actually very interested in a lot of research about body and breath and uh, group connectivity in engagement from historical times. Like early chanting and how people connect with each other, because that's when you form community.
Well, and I mean, you're looking at those photos, and I'm sure everybody didn't know each other, right? But afterwards, I'm sure that maybe they felt comfortable being able to just say, "Oh, bye," like just that gestural, just acknowledgement, right? I know when I go into other cities, I live in San Jose, so when I go into other cities, like say New Orleans, I I get "Oh, hey, how you doing today?" Just that acknowledgement, you feel a sense of community. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, and I'm deeply gratified that a kind of core Chinese whispers community has formed over the years. Many of them are the performers. For the Golden Gate production, we did some really serious theater rehearsing and bonding and learning. And again, like I said, I believe that part of what connects us together is a mutual understanding that this is important, not just to us personally, but for a community and really for society. This is one example of how it's done in this instance. But as you said earlier, this is true for other communities and other cultures. Erasure did not just happen to the Chinese.
Right.
And
Exactly.
erasure is happening now.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I see another question that came up. It says, I heard that the government only allowed men to immigrate at first to keep them busy working, and any other reasons. Can you talk about this?
Well, the Exclusion Act only allowed merchants to come. And I when I was steeped in research, I could rattle out the numbers. At this point, it's gone to an archive somewhere. And but there were numerous anti-Chinese legislations throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. And only certain kinds of immigrants were allowed. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, today? At least we're not doing gender restriction. And so in the stories we have, by the very late 19th century and early 20th, women were coming over. People who emigrated who were successful, because it takes resources like now to send somebody all the way, 6,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean to come. Then they could send for their wives or family. And many men went back to China to marry and then bring their brides over. And so that would be kind of, towards the, like I said, the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century where that began to happen more. But these were most likely people in the merchant classes.
Yes.
The allowed class.
Yes, I remember reading about that in research I've done as well. We wanted to ask, So you know that we are going to be honoring the historical contributions of women through public art, right? And so, how important is it, would you say, or what is the impact that you see with creating recognition projects through different platforms and artistic disciplines?
Certainly, I'm thrilled and I'm excited that you're creating this project. I think women are, well, let me quote one of the maritime partner community. He really fervently said to me, "Oh, the sea is our mother, the mare." And you could say the other way around, right? Women is the sea, the ocean, the water that gave us birth. And I also want to say, again, veering into personal, um, I think I wouldn't have been as fiercely politically inclined if I had not been born female in Chinese culture. That is still has one foot anchored in thousands of years of tradition. Confucius, when I studied classical Chinese as an undergraduate, I loved the power of the classical Chinese. And I was shocked and outraged at the social system that put women really, really down low in the totem pole. And that tradition really has lasted. There are various classifications. And this is just one particular culture, but it is not unique. And I think what you're doing with honoring women is really important to bring the conversation out. And also, as you mentioned earlier, I think it's not just the famous women, right? It's not Eleanor Roosevelt or, whoever. These are just, I don't want to say ordinary. Nobody is particularly ordinary when you actually really look at them, right? But individuals who lead their lives without being called important, and yet are foundations for what happens in community. I think that's really important what you're doing.
Absolutely. That's exactly the way we've been thinking and talking about this project amongst each other and to the public. So, thank you so much for recognizing that. How do you think that the county should honor women to the region? I mean, you've done, as you said, the project with the burning down of what was previously Chinatown here in San Jose. What would you like to see? Would you like to see public art? Would you like to see placemaking? Maybe there's something else that maybe we just haven't even thought of.
Well, I think what is public art is a whole other conversation, right? I actually did a lot of more traditional kinds of public art earlier in my career, the bricks and mortar stuff, the stuff that lasts. And I eventually began to try to sneak more and more community engagement into the public art until I realized, you know what? That is what I want to do.
Yes.
And so I would love to see a public art that I think there's a place for the monumental, the stuff that is durable in concrete form, in some kind of material form. I also think that the engagement in the process to enlarge the idea of what is monumental, what is public. And I think of As the Pandemic certainly as an anti-monument, to a monumental time. There's no single hero, it's all transitory. It's on social media, who knows how long Instagram will last. Right?
Yeah.
And so to consider, kind of a multivalent definition of public art and how that takes shape.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that especially watching your presentation and seeing all the different ways that people were able to engage. There's so many different avenues that we can go about when it comes to public art. So that is a whole nother conversation. Absolutely. And we also wanted to ask, can you express to our viewers, why should people participate in these types of projects for their communities? We're really looking at this question more as seeing how community interest really is part of the participatory part of the research, right? I think what we would really like to see is how are people going to want to share their stories? Am I making sense? I'm sorry.
Let me see if I can answer it in this way. I think I mentioned the aspect of trust, of having your motivation be clear. And then I think that people begin to open up when they realize that what they tell you, what they share, has larger significance. That it adds to the bank, and also that that sense of being given agency. Like the YMCA new immigrant workshops.
Mm-hmm.
There were so many tears. I mean, it was actually kind of heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
Because they got to say what nobody wants to hear, like how
Yeah.
hard it is or whatever, in their case. Not
Right.
not everybody has tragic stories, but just being given voice and then to be made visible. And for example, just as an example for the Golden Gate storytelling, I was worried that the immigrants wouldn't want me to then, it's one thing that they share their story with you, but it's another thing to say, well, I'm actually going to put it on stage in a theater production. Most of them sparked up. It's like, wow, people actually get to hear a story. Now they refuse to get on stage. We do a lot of performance training as part of this so that community members would feel comfortable and also do a good performance. But in the San Francisco Bay Area, to my great surprise, most people are saying, no, I'm going to give you my story, but I am not going on stage. Whereas in the Sierra, it was so interesting. People just said, sure. And I think that has to do with the sense of community and size of community and, what is public, what is private. In the Sierra, unfortunately, we didn't have any good photos of her. There was a 92-year-old woman, Adele, who sat there and calmly told her story on stage. In Golden Gate, we have Ford Lee, this marvelous senior and a real stakeholder in the community. He was on stage not only telling his stories, he was telling the script. He was performing from memory and ad-libbing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I love that. Oh my goodness. Is there a place where we can see those or?
I am remiss in putting that online.
Okay.
We have DVDs of the
Okay.
performance, and maybe in the chat we could put the contact, and people could contact me,
Okay.
about how to get them.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, Rene, this has been a fabulous conversation. I can keep going, but I see it's getting closer to our time. So I want to just leave some space and offer you if there's anything else you'd like to share before I give our closing comments.
No, thank you so much. This has been so invigorating, so thought-provoking. It makes me want to, dream up other stuff. And also, I want to thank you for this opportunity to review this body of work called Chinese Whispers that I kind of dove into. It's like, oh, yeah, it would be cool to go follow the trail of the Transcontinental Railroad and see what people say, and what it became and the way I learned how, in a way, to do this kind of work, this kind of art. So thank you for this opportunity. It's been really a great recognition of myself. Yeah.
Well, we are so happy to have you here. We really are.
Thank you.
And I hope you don't mind. I'm definitely going to reach out to you after this to find out some more information
Oh,
on your
please.
project.
Please, I would be delighted to continue conversation. And this is an example of how we build community and partnerships, basically. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. So thank you again so much for spending your afternoon with me and everyone else that's on here and whoever's outside in my backyard blowing something. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rene Yung. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I just want to let everyone know that we're going to be starting to move these conversations to Sundays in June. So please visit our website, www.womanhoodproject.org, and sign up for our newsletters so that you definitely keep engaged. I also want to mention briefly our mapping project. So what is Mapping Women's History campaign? It's one of the campaigns we're working on. This project is an opportunity to reclaim women's role in our region as we reconsider issues of representation and cultural equity. And I'm so sorry, I am echoing. Womenhood will employ artists from all disciplines as storytellers, revealing women's histories, as trailblazers, artists, explorers, and essential workers. An online mapping platform will enable community members to identify locations where women's contributions may be recognized through public artworks, naming and renaming significant sites. A permanent digital archive will connect projects to place, engage the public, and promote education, exploration, and play. So as a reminder, the Artists Honoring Women program will now transition to the second Sunday brunch time. Please register for next month's Artist Talk at artistshonoringwomen.eventbrite.com or find out more about upcoming projects and announcements at womanhoodproject.org and sign up for our newsletter. Thank you again.